Hi there, I'm digital artist Aaron Rutten, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can do a nice seascape painting with a lot of really cool looking trees. So as you can see in my example, I have a lot of layers going on here, and we'll go through these one by one from beginning to end, and I'll show you why it's good to use more than one layer when you're painting. So I'm going to start by creating a new canvas from the File menu, and this particular example we will make 11 by 14. So it's always better to set your resolution first. So we'll go ahead and just set it to 72, but you could also set your resolution a little bit higher to 150 or 300 for stuff that you're going to want to print. But for this example, we'll just leave it here at 72. And after setting our resolution, we'll set our height to 11 and our width to 14. So now we've got a nice standard canvas size here, and then we'll go to OK. And we have our new canvas. I'm holding the space bar to pan my page by dragging my pen. And another helpful shortcut is the tab key. You might see me use that periodically to hide my palettes temporarily. And so we'll go ahead and get started here. So on our canvas layer, this should really just be called layer 0. It's really just the bottommost layer. So if you haven't worked with layers very much, it could be confusing that this is called canvas. We'll go ahead and use this layer for our sky, since our sky is going to be the furthest object away from us. So we'll pick a kind of blue-green color. Maybe we'll try something like this for our sky color. And I'm going to use the paint bucket tool and make sure it's set to current color. I'm just going to tap and fill, and I think it's an okay color. I might try this lime color and see how I feel about that. I think that's a little bit better for what I'm going for. And now we want to select the digital airbrush. It's in the airbrushes category. And you may want to calibrate this brush if it's not working properly, but the way it should be working is it should just deposit color evenly and smoothly across your canvas. Kind of like so. You don't really want it to build up too hard like this because you're not going to get the desired effect. We want some color that kind of transitions smoothly. So I'm using kind of light pressure here to do this. And I'm going to darken the top of the sky a little bit. Might even switch our hue towards blue a little bit here. Put in a little bit of blue at the top of the sky. Now we have a little bit of a color gradient going on here. Now our horizon is going to be right about here. So what we'll do is we'll make it easier on us, and we'll make a new layer by clicking this new layer button here. Make sure preserve transparency is not turned on. And let's name this new layer by double clicking it, and let's call this C. Now this will do two things for us. One, it will give us a layer to put our ocean onto, and two, it will help us establish where our horizon line is going to be. And that's a very important thing to establish early on in the painting because you're going to have to base everything else around that. So on our C layer, we're going to take the rectangular selection tool, and we're going to start by drawing outside of our canvas in this gray area, and we're going to tap and we're going to drag, and we're going to release outside of the canvas on this gray area. That's going to force this selection to cover the entire canvas. If I don't go outside of the selection and I try to click in here, chances are I might not go right to the edge, and we don't want that to happen. So go outside your canvas here, start your selection, and end outside the canvas. And there you go. You've got a selection that fills the whole canvas there, except for this top part. And I'm going to use the paint bucket again, and we'll pick a C color. I think we'll take something like this teal color here. And I'm going to use the paint bucket to tap and fill it with some color. Now I'm going to do a Control D to deselect that selection, and now we have our C layer, and we also have a horizon line. Now for this particular piece, I want the sky to be really light at the horizon, so I'm going to go back to the canvas layer, which has our sky on it, And we'll put in the light area using this light yellow color here and the airbrush. And we're just going to lighten along the horizon. So now we have even more of a gradient. I might go a little lighter with white because our main light source is going to be right around here, this point here. And I think that will do for the sky for now. Let's go to the sea layer and let's add some shading to that. So we use the digital airbrush and we'll hold Alt on the keyboard to sample this sky color here. Use a pretty big airbrush, and we want to turn on preserve transparency also. Preserve transparency will make sure that we can only paint within this sea area here. We won't be able to paint off of it or onto our sky. If I change my color to something extreme, you can see if I'm painting up here, nothing happens, but as soon as I come down here onto this sea layer, it's confining my painting within that shape. So it can be really helpful. So we'll use that sky color and we'll paint in a nice gradient. So we want where it's closer to the horizon to be a bit lighter, and we want it to just kind of fade into the sea color as you get away from the light source. We'll sample one of these lighter colors here, closer to the horizon, and we'll put in a little more of this. A big brush works really well. Again, you don't want really hard, chunky stuff like this. You want nice, soft, smooth transitions. So it looks like the light's kind of emanating out from that point. You could even pull down a little bit, straight down, to make a kind of sheen on the water. So we've got something like that. It'll work. Let's make another layer. Let's move it below the sea layer by dragging it below the layer till you see this blue line, and then let go. And let's name this layer, this will be some hills or mountains that are far away. Now, if we want to be able to paint on this new layer, we have to make sure to turn off preserve transparency. Otherwise, you won't be able to do anything, so turn that off. And we'll we'll sample this sky color here. Let's shift it a little bit towards this green in the hue. Let's maybe gray it down a little bit. We'll drag our color target here to the left a little bit. And let's use the digital airbrush for this again. Now, this is a case where we can use a smaller brush, and if we get a harder edge with this brush, that's okay. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of scrub back and forth, side to side, to kind of draw in some mountain shapes. This could be really anything. Hills, mountains, trees, cliffs, anything. It's kind of up to you. Now that those are in there on their own layer, let's turn on preserve transparency so that we can only paint within this shape that we just made. And let's sample our lighter color on our horizon. Now, it helps these hills to look more distant if we lighten the bottom, if we make a gradient that goes from the bottom to the top, as we were doing with our sky here and with our water. You'll start to see that these gradients are really important. It really helps your painting look interesting, and it helps it look more natural, more realistic. These gradients imply distance. There's a certain distance from this lighter color to this darker color, and you can see this movement, this gradual change. It's not static, it's not all one color. It's got character, and it implies distance by there being these gradients. So we've got our distant hills now, and we can play around with these hills a little bit too. Let's take a orange color, something like this, and we'll use our digital airbrush, and in this lighter area, let's just, with very light pressure, tint a little bit of this hill here. And now you can see there's a nice gradient from a warmer orange-brown going into this green. That gives it some more character and some more flavor, and kind of makes this brighter area look a little warmer. And as you get further away from the lighter area, it gets cooler. And I'm just kind of picking these colors it's kind of a surreal color palette. You know, it's not really, you wouldn't really see much of a green sky like this in real life. So you can imagine this as being a painting that I'm doing that maybe has filters on it or something, you know. The next thing that we will do is, let's add some texture to this water, give it a little more distance. So let's use the digital airbrush. We can keep preserve transparency on. Let's sample this darkest color here in our sea. Let's shift our hue more towards indigo, and let's go straight down with our color target here towards a darker color like this. We use a big airbrush. I'm resizing my pen on the fly by holding down Control and Alt and then tapping and dragging, and you can see I can make my brush any size that I want. You could also configure your pen, one of your pen buttons, to do that also. I have a shortcut for that where I hold down my pen button and that lets me resize my brush. Big brush is really important here to get this nice gradient, and using tab to make your palettes go away is really helpful so that you don't accidentally grab a palette. And I make a nice gradient here at the bottom. So now you can see we've got this distance. Generally speaking, what's closer to you, or it's closer to the foreground in the painting, will generally be darker, and what's further away will generally be lighter, depending on where the light source is. Assuming the light source is far away, which it is here, what's further away from the light source would be this area here, which is darker. On the other hand, if there were a light over here for some reason, this would not necessarily be the darkest area in the painting. So you can kind of take or leave that rule depending on what you're doing. But in this case, we want this area to be darker, and I made it more indigo just to give it a little more flavor. So let's add some texture to the sea. So we'll do a nice little trick here. Let's say we want to take this kind of stenciling effect that we're getting by using preserve transparency, but do it on another layer. What we can do is turn off preserve transparency, and then we can go to the select menu and go to select layer content. That puts a selection around whatever's on the layer that you have selected. So right now that's this sea that we've been painting here. Now if we make a new layer, this selection goes with us to this new layer here. So if we paint on this new layer, our painting will be confined to this selection area. So long story short, what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to add some details to our sea on a new layer, but it will still confine them within this area here so that we won't be able to paint on our sky accidentally. The next thing that we'll do is let's change the composite method of this layer. And what this does is you could kind of think of this as maybe changing the type of paint that you're painting with. Some paints are opaque and they'll cover up things, and some paints are transparent and they'll blend or tint things. So this controls how one layer blends with the layers underneath it. Setting it to multiply will allow you to do some tinting and make things darker. So we'll select multiply, and we'll use the loaded palette knife, and we can go ahead and just stick with this color that we have here. Let's use a kind of medium-sized brush, something like this, and let's set our opacity a little bit lower to maybe 17, somewhere in that range, and we'll start painting. So what we're going to get as a test stroke is something like this. If we use light pressure, let's make it a little bit, let's go down to 5 here, something like that. It's a bit better. We're going to get something like this. So again, if we're going to kind of follow this realism, this perspective here, we have to follow some rules for our texture and our shapes. So in the same way that we have a gradient of color, we're going to have a gradient of feature size. And what I mean by feature is, let's say we have some waves in the foreground. If they're this big, they need to get smaller as they go into the distance, if that makes sense, so that there's some illusion that everything in the background is smaller and everything in the foreground is bigger, because that's how it would be. Let's hide this selection while still keeping it active by doing Control-Shift-H. And then let's go ahead and paint. So we'll start from the background. Use a kind of smaller brush and just kind of make some wave shapes. I'm doing something kind of like this. I'm really just kind of throwing them in kind of spontaneously. Try to keep them all the same size. Just kind of go straight across. Do them in rows. And as you move down to the next row, make your brush a little bit bigger and make the shapes a little bit broader. More space in between these lines now. You can make them a little bit darker and a little bit bolder. Something like that. Make our brush even bigger. And look at this illusion of distance. Now we probably only need to go down to about here because we're going to have the rest of this area be covered up by some trees. Let's go ahead and go back to this sea layer now, and we'll put in a little bit of highlights. Now, the reason why we added this layer now is you can see we have these extra lines that we made. These are kind of on their own layer, so if at some point we mess these up and we can't do undos or erase, that saves you from having to repaint all of this stuff here that's on the sea layer. So these layers really just make it easier for you to experiment and try things without ruining your painting or having to repaint things and waste a lot of time. So let's name this layer Sea Texture. Yes, I don't really get too creative with these names. We'll go back to the sea layer. We'll turn on Preserve Transparency so that we can't accidentally paint on our sky. And let's sample this light color here by our horizon. Let's use this same loaded palette knife to put in some highlight areas here. I have to go a little bit lighter. Let's go to almost white here. And near our light source, I'm just going to put in some little lines. I'll zoom in so you can see exactly what I'm doing here. Just putting in some highlights right around this light source. Zoom back out. And let's add a little bit more detail with the loaded palette knife. Let's sample our one of these middle colors here. Let's lighten it just a little bit up and to the right with your color picker. Let's add a few more little highlights here and there, just to give the water a little bit more character. I think that will work. And now we can begin to blend some of this a little bit. So I don't think we'll be doing anything else to this part of the background. So it's up to you at this point. If you want to keep these layers separate, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and merge all of these layers into a single layer because I don't need them to be independent anymore, and I'm going to want to blend them all together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Layers, Drop All. Now you really want to make sure that you're certain you want to do this. So if you're uncertain, what you could do is you could really quickly just do a Save As and save a copy of your artwork, and then you can have two versions. You can have one copy with your layers that you can go back to, and you can have another copy that's flattened, which is what will happen after we do this Drop All. Now all those layers become a single layer. Now if we wanted to do something like blend all these layers together, we could do that. Now one thing that happens to me a lot, because I always forget, is that I have a selection active but I can't see it, and we did that Control-Shift-H earlier to hide the selection. Well, guess what, it's still there, and it's pretty easy to forget about it being there. But if you see something like this happening where you can only paint on part of your canvas, that's because that selection's still active. So all we need to do is do a Control-D to deselect that selection, and now we can paint freely. So what I want to do is not mess up my canvas like you were seeing there, but I want to use a blur blender to, for one, blur the horizon line. If I zoom in, you can see what I did there. It made it less sharp. It makes it look more distant. And in the same way that we achieved a gradient with color, we can achieve a gradient with blurring. So what's furthest away should be the blurriest, and what's closer to us in the foreground should be sharper. Let's use the diffuse blur brush. It's also a blender. And I'm going to go ahead and blend kind of horizontally back and forth, side to side, to blend out some of these sharp details in the water. Just make everything softer. And we can blend the sky a little bit too. You might notice that digital airbrush makes it a little grainy. Try to stay away from your edges. If you blend from the outside of your canvas in, sometimes you can pull in some weird white color, so watch out for that. Just kind of blend it in the center here. Light pressure. This diffuse blur works in two ways. If you use light pressure, you kind of blur it. If you use heavy pressure, you'll really blend out the details, so you have to watch out for that. If you do really want to remove details, push down hard, and if you just want to fuzz it a little bit, push down lightly as you can. So now we have a nice gradient of blurriness, and now we have some more distance in our sky and background. So let's make some more new layers now. Create a new layer, and let's just kind of establish where some of our main leaves are. So let's do these as leaves close. So these will be the leaves that are the closest to us. It'll be one big clump. So when you're doing leaves, it's best to start with your shadow color first and then add lighter and lighter colors on top of that to achieve a natural leaf effect. So in this particular piece, the leaves that are the closest to us will be pretty dark. We'll go ahead and use an almost black, really dark green, something like this. And I have some custom brushes saved, but I'll show you how I went ahead and made these. So in the artist brush category, there is an impressionist brush. So you'll want to start with that. Once you have that impressionist brush, you'll want to open your advanced brush controls. If you're working with Painter 12, you'll just want to get to that through the window menu, and you'll want to find angle. We'll want to set angle expression to random, and stroke jitter to 97 or 0.97%. And I believe that's all I changed for this particular brush. Your opacity can be at 90, and then your bleed at 84, and we'll change the size here and there. Make sure your size expression is set to pressure, and change your spacing to 25%, and everything should be looking good. Now, you'll also want to change your color variability. That's found in the window menu under brush control panels, color variability, if you want it open all the time, or you can also find it here. You want to set this to 2, 2, and 3. Now what this is going to do is this is going to just change the color ever so slightly so that all your leaves that you're painting aren't always the same color. It'll just make it look a little more natural. So I know that was a lot of explaining on what I did with the brush there, but it'll come in handy. So now if we do a test stroke, you can see that if you push down really hard, you get these big leaves, and if you push down lightly, you get these little leaves. And that's important because leaves on trees aren't always all the same size, and you want to really be able to quickly kind of vary the shape. So depends on what kind of trees and what kind of leaves you're trying to paint, but for the most part, your tree or your bush is going to have a general shape Now this is not how I would start drawing it. I'm just showing you maybe the shape that I'm envisioning. Maybe it's something like this, and you know, everything else would be filled in here. So what you want to do is you want to try to envision this shape ahead of time, but when you paint your leaves in, you want to paint them in as clumps and kind of individual strokes. So I'm going to use varying pressure, and I'm going to kind of pull my leaves or my brush strokes in certain directions. So the first thing you want to do is have them grow in clumps. The second thing you want to do is have them usually bigger leaves in the center and then smaller leaves on the ends. So I'm accomplishing that by using firm pressure to light pressure. And then the direction that the leaves are going, you kind of want them to look like they're growing or possibly hanging, depending on the kind of tree that you want. So the direction of the leaves is also very important. You can't just take this brush and just go like this and just make trees, because I mean, it's going to kind of look like a bush, but it's not going to have that much character. All of your trees are going to look like the same tree. It's not going to look natural. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you the proper shape to make here. So I'm just going to spontaneously just kind of draw on these different clumps here, and I'm kind of jumping around from area to area. My strokes are going in different directions. I'm using varying pressure, having a kind of general direction for everything to flow. Now, if you know that the center is just going to be a big solid mass of leaves that you can't see through, you can go ahead and make your brush pretty big and then just quickly fill all that in. It's all going to be pretty dark anyway, so you don't have to worry about that being detailed. But towards the edges here, you want there to be a lot of nice fractal patterns. So you want there to be some holes and gaps in between these leaves. You don't want to cover them all up and have it be too thick. Something like that looks pretty good. Maybe we'll do a few more down here too. Okay, so we have our closest clump of trees. Now we're going to go ahead and put some colors on it to make it kind of stand out and look more three-dimensional. So we'll use this preserve transparency trick. We'll turn that on, and now we'll pick a leaf color. So the dark colors on a tree, generally speaking, are a little bit more towards this end of the green, because you got a lot of greens here. You got this kind of green, and you got this kind of green, and everything in between. So the shadows, the dark areas, are usually over here. They're cooler, and the highlights are usually warmer. Now it's up to you which colors you want to use. You don't even have to use a green. Some trees are orange and different colors. So for this particular tree, we're going to use something like this, an almost yellow-green, and we're going to try this color here, see how this looks, and we'll do a test stroke to see what we get. I think that's a little too bright. Something like this I like better. So now, again with the gradients, you want there to be a lot of black for this particular piece, and then you want there to be less highlights. So each time you make your color brighter and brighter for the highlights, use less and less of that color. So want there to be a lot of dark. So this is going to be our next darkest color here. Our light source is here, so we want all of our shadows to be facing away from our light source, and we want our highlights to be facing towards it. So for instance, our highlights would be on this side here, but if we're on this side of the tree, they would be here, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to kind of tap and drag, and using those same kind of brush strokes and gestures that I was using before, to put in some highlights. Something like that. Now let's change our color a little bit. Let's shift it a little bit more towards green. We'll just pick an entirely different color. It's good to have leaves that are slightly different and vary in color. You don't want it to vary too much. It'll look like a different tree, but you want it to vary a little bit. Now, if you find that you go too far, you do a little too much, you can always sample this dark color and you can add some dark back in. And sometimes it's good to layer it like this. It makes it look a little more natural. You can see I'm kind of covering up some of that highlight. I added too much. You really just kind of want it to be on the edge, but see I'm getting this gradient. There's a lot of thick kind of leaves here, and then it starts to get broken up and kind of disintegrate into that black again. Really gives the effect that that light's coming in and it's only hitting the leaves that are close, and then everything else is getting blocked out. And that's really the effect that we want. So we'll add some more highlights. We'll sample our kind of mid-tone color there. Let's go up and to the right slightly with our color picker. Shift it a little bit towards, maybe we'll go into this yellow color more. And now we want even fewer highlights here. So I'm using these sparingly. We get something like that. I can brighten it more. Even less of that. Again, as you add these highlights, you want there to be fewer highlights than shadows. In a piece that's brighter, you would probably want it the other way around. There would be a lot of highlights and less shadows, but this is a really dark piece, so that's why we're doing it this way. Something like that will work. Now, the next thing that we'll do is let's look at how to do sticks and branches. So we'll make a new layer and we'll turn off preserve transparency. Let's move this sticks layer below our leaves close layer, and let's call it sticks. And a good brush for sticks is the Detail Oils brush. You can use this same dark color. We'll just sample it and make sure your opacity is set to 100. And when you draw with this brush, you should get a kind of nice line that you can make thicker or thinner. And really we'll just kind of draw in some different sticks and twigs that kind of poke up out of here and connect some of these leaves that are just floating. You want to imagine that these sticks kind of all emanate from a trunk or a bigger branch. So trees have this kind of forking pattern. You have your trunk, and then your trunk gets smaller and becomes a branch and forks, and then that branch forks even smaller to another branch, which forks even smaller. So each time you fork, you get smaller and smaller and smaller. Again, it's this kind of like what we're doing with the background here. There's a kind of gradient or a pattern. So that's kind of what you want to follow. Most of the time you want to alternate your sticks. And every once in a while you can have one that's on the same side, but it looks a little more natural if you kind of stagger them like this. Just going to erase this example here, and we'll keep adding in some more sticks. Just doing these kind of spontaneously. I'm not thinking about them too much. These might end up getting covered up quite a bit, so you don't have to put in a whole lot of them. If you wanted to do some in the foreground, you could do that. You can make a new layer, call it Sticks FG, which is short for foreground. You would want to use a lighter color, so maybe sample one of these sky colors here, and you could draw in some sticks in the foreground that go in front of the leaves. But when you get down in this dark area, you probably don't want to do too many. Light wouldn't really be getting in there. So we got a nice looking clump of trees here. Now we can do a few more of those. So let's put another clump of trees behind this clump of trees in the foreground. make a new layer. We'll call it leaves middle. This will be some leaves in the middle. And we'll go ahead and put these behind all of the other layers. And now the trick here, we'll use the same brush. Trick here will be, we want to sample the darkest color that's in our foreground leaves, and we want to make sure that the color that we use for the leaves behind it is a little bit lighter. So again, with this gradient thing, our ocean is lighter here and it's darker here in the foreground. I want the same thing to happen with these clumps of leaves. Each plane, or each section, each layer of leaves should be progressively lighter and lighter and lighter as it goes towards your light source. So we'll go up and to the right a little bit with our color to lighten it. Maybe we'll shift it a little bit up on the hue here. We'll do a test. We'll see how dark that is. Now that's way too light. So we'll go back down here a little bit. Still too light. I'm going to try again. I'm going to sample this dark color. Let's move it just a little bit. That's better. You want it to be a subtle difference. It might not even be noticeable, but as long as you know that you moved it and made it lighter, that's enough. So we'll go ahead and put in some more clumps of leaves here. So remember, these can be different kinds of trees, so you can illustrate these in different ways. Rather than doing the same kind of clumps that we did before, we can do some like this, and maybe these are entirely different kinds of trees. Something like that, and then maybe over here we'll do a tree kind of like the other one that we were doing down there towards the bottom. Now there's a lot of variety. It's not all the same tree. Because if this starts to look like it's all one big, huge, giant bush, it's not going to be good. My brush a little bigger just to fill in this whole area down here. That can all be pretty dark. There we go. It's looking pretty good. Now we'll put some highlights on that by turning on Preserve Transparency. And we can pick whatever colors we want. We don't even have to use that green color. Let's use maybe a kind of orange color here. Now I'm putting highlights only on the side that's facing towards the light. So you got a shadow side and you got a light side. Let's say for this tree, before I start putting on too many, let's change the color just a little bit so that we don't have the same tree, because these trees are pretty individual. It's almost hard to tell where one tree begins and ends over here, but let's have these here, let's have these be distinct. Okay, and then maybe we'll change it a little more for the other tree. Now we have some individuality with our tree. Gives it more character. Put some highlights on these trees. Being kind of spontaneous. I think the more paintings you do, the more insight you'll have as to which colors you should pick, and it'll come a little more naturally to you. Just kind of pick whatever colors I feel like picking, but they are kind of educated decisions. Let's do be a kind of green for these leaves back here. And we'll change the color a little bit to give it some flavor. Add some highlights. And again, if we found that we added too much, we can sample this dark color and we can throw in some dark color. Maybe I want to subdue that a little bit. looks a little bit better. Don't really want to overdo the highlights here. Something like that looks better. And we can go ahead and just use the same sticks layer if we want. We can draw in some more sticks. We'll want to use this dark color from our tree layer here. We can put in some branches and limbs and trunks and all kinds of stuff. We can go to the stick's foreground layer, sample this light background color. We can put in some trunks and branches here. These details really make the piece come together and give it a lot of character. You don't really have to think about them. I'm just really kind of throwing them in really quick. And just kind of put in some stuff there to give it a little bit more of a focal point. You have some sticks coming from outside the page too. Helps a little bit. Okay, so even more trees now. Let's do a really big, kind of obvious tree in the background. So we'll make a new layer. We'll move it behind all the other layers. We'll call it Leaves BG. That's short for background. So again, we'll sample our darkest color, and we want to lighten it. So we'll do a test here with our brush, and we'll see if it's light enough. And I think that looks pretty good. So now we'll do another tree here. Now you could do these in the reverse order. I thought for this tutorial it would make more sense to do the foreground trees first. That way you could kind of see what the composition would be. You can work background to foreground or foreground to background. That's kind of your personal preference. It varies from piece to piece for me. But for instance here, it might have been easier to do this tree first before doing the foreground trees, but you know, it's really all the same. Put some highlights on this tree here. You can turn on preserve transparency. That helps a little bit to not overdo your shape. So you don't want to fill in these trees too much. As I mentioned before, you want to have these gaps. And if you find for some reason maybe you do make a tree that has too many leaves and you want to make some gaps in it, don't use the eraser. Because the problem is, if you use the eraser, you're going to poke smooth circular holes into your leaves, and there aren't any smooth circular shapes there on a real tree. It's all hard, sharp fractals. So what you're going to want to do is, instead of using the eraser, use a mask. Click this new layer mask button on the layer that you want to poke a hole in. That creates this little mask icon. If you click on this mask, when you paint, you'll paint into the mask. And if you don't know what a mask is, you should watch one of my videos on masking. But basically what it will do is it will let you conceal parts of your layer or temporarily erase them. So if I paint with any brush, just about any brush, into my mask with black, 100% black, I'll get the effect of erasing, and I'll be erasing with the shape of the brush that I'm using. So you can see that makes better looking holes that are more natural. We could do it, let's do it here on these leaves in the foreground. And you'll be able to really see what this does. See how it's poking these holes in it? Do it some more here. It's really just kind of working like an eraser. It's not erasing it though, because if I use white, I can bring those shapes back. So it's masking it. It's kind of hiding it, which is why it's called a mask. So I'll go back a few steps here, and we'll just delete this layer mask, and we'll delete this layer mask. Now you have to watch out, because if you clicked on that little mask layer here, you're going to paint in the mask. You can see how it switches back and forth. If I want to paint on the layer and add color, I have to be painting here. If I want to paint in the mask with black or white, I have to be clicked on this. Then you can, of course, right-click on it and do delete or any other thing you want to do. Let's add some more sticks. Let's go on the sticks foreground layer and sample that light color again, and we'll put in some sticks for this tree back here. It's got some nice branches. We can go to the sticks layer. Let's call this sticks BG so that we know what's background and foreground. And again, we'll sample one of our dark colors from our tree, because we don't want the background sticks to be as dark as the foreground sticks. We want there to be that difference in lightness or value. We're coming along pretty well here. So when we get closer to the foreground, we need to do some bigger leaves, and unfortunately this Impressionist brush doesn't look so hot when you get big with it. These leaves don't quite look the way I want them to. So at this point, when I get into the foreground, I start to use some different brushes. So I have a palette knife that I made that's called Feather Knife. I'll show you how I made that. I started with the loaded palette knife, and I went into my advanced brush controls here, and I went to angle, and I set the expression to velocity. I believe that is it. And then there's a little bit of color variability. Opacity is 100%, features 0.7, resaturation and bleed 100%. So what this does is it makes some pretty weird random shapes. If you do a really fast brush stroke, you get this kind of leaf or feather shape. Originally I thought it looked really good for feathers, but then I found it works pretty good for leaves too. If you do a slow stroke, you get some kind of weird looking stuff. So what you want to do is you kind of just want to make really fast, short little strokes. You'll have to try it to get the hang of it, but you get these things that look like leaves. And when leaves are closer, they take a lot of different shapes depending on their angle and depending on the type of leaf. So that's why this works really well, because I can get all different kinds of leaves depending on which way I use my brush. It's not as uniform as this is, which doesn't look as natural. So with this feather knife or this leaf knife, make some pretty big leaves now. So here you really want to think about clumps again and the direction of the leaves, and you kind of want them to be a little bit random. Want there to be some different size, so you'll have to change your brush size a little bit. Try to get them to go in different directions. Do them in clumps. This gets a little tricky here because you have to paint a lot of different leaves, and you get something like that. Let's put some of them over here. And there you go. We'll turn on preserve transparency, and let's put some highlights on these. Change the color a little bit. Get some more flavor. I'm going to make this one over here orange. The other side needs more of a highlight. A couple spots here. That's popping out a little bit better. Now let's play around with the position of these. Maybe we'll move them. I don't like how high they are. I want to move them a little bit lower. So I'm just going to reposition them. And we'll make a new layer for the sticks for this. Let's call this limbs. Again, I'm not being very creative with these names. So these are in the foreground, so let's go ahead and just use black, since that'll be dark. We'll use the detail oils brush, pretty good sized brush. We really want to define some major limbs here and connect them to all these clumps now. So where these leaves kind of end, you want your branches to end. So you're just kind of doing like connect the dots here. Now it all comes together. You see, they looked kind of weird before, but now they're starting to look like leaves. Over here you can't really see much, but what you can see you should fill in. And then if we want to add some highlights to those limbs, turn on preserve transparency, sample one of these light colors. We'll maybe shift a little bit towards yellow, and we'll put in a little bit of highlight, not too much, just kind of follow the direction of a couple of those sticks here and there. This is really a subtle thing. Sometimes less is more. If you can just barely see it, it's probably perfect and good enough. So something like that. I feel like maybe we'll go back to this leaves layer and let's put in a couple of really bright leaves in a couple spots, just to really make it pop out and give it some more character. A couple real dead leaves on this one too. Helps a little bit. And maybe we'll sample one of these darker leaf colors. It will erase, not really erase, but cover up a little bit of that. I think it just stood out too much in my mind. Now there's another way we can do foreground leaves, and I recommend doing this for the really, really, really big, really close leaves. So let's just call this big leaves. So these big leaves can also be black since they're the closest. And let's use the scratchboard tool that's in the pens category. And you really want to use your pressure sensitivity here. So if I push down light, I get this thin line, and if I push down heavy, I get this thick line, and I can get anything in between. So what I want is I want to do these quick strokes that start out light, and then they get heavy, and then they end light. But I'm going to do them really fast, and that's going to make a leaf. See how I get these leaf shapes? Now this is just a magic touch here. You kind of have to really let up off of your brush right at the right moment for this to work. Now some of your leaves are going to be going kind of sideways, so you want to have some sideways leaves as well. Little leaves, clumps, all that stuff that we were doing before. Okay, we got our leaves. Now we don't need to put any highlights on these because maybe these are really dark and they're just right there in the foreground. But we do want to give them some branches, so we'll just call this big branches. We'll use the same brush and we'll draw in some limbs for these leaves. And again, it's kind of connect the dot. You want them to, your branches to kind of emanate from a central point and then go to the end of all these leaves to kind of give the leaves something to attach to. Get something like that. Let's go back to the big leaves layer and let's use that same masking trick. Let's create a mask and let's use this feather knife for that. We'll use black. Make sure you're painting inside of the mask. Let's just poke some holes in some of these leaves. It's a detail that gets overlooked sometimes. So we got some holes in our leaves. Now let's go ahead and let's merge these branches and these leaves together. So I'm going to hold Shift to select both layers. And I'm going to go to the layer commands here, and I'm going to go to collapse layers. Now that fuses those two layers into a single layer. Now that those layers are merged, we can blend them a little bit. So let's set the blend mode to, or the composite method, let's set that to multiply. And make sure preserve transparency is not on. Let's use the blur blender, pretty big brush, and let's blur this pretty evenly. Not too much though. You can see it pushes it kind of more into the foreground by making it blurrier, more out of focus. We could do that with some of our other layers too if we wanted to. So at this point I recommend saving, and if you want to save a copy, go ahead and do that, because we're going to do a canvas or layers, drop all, and then if you want to, you can go through with this blur brush and you can blur some of the stuff that's in the background a little bit more to make it kind of go further away. So you really get kind of a perspective now after we do that. Okay, last thing that we'll add is another new layer. We'll call that glow. And this will be a screen blend mode. We'll pick a nice glow color, kind of something close to what our sky is, so maybe color like this. We use the glow brush, it's in the FX brush category. Screen blend mode is very important because it'll make this look more natural, like it's light. We're going to use a pretty big brush, and we're going to want a gradient that's light in the center, very bright in the center, and then kind of gets a little more colorful as it goes out towards the edge. So we'll do a test with this brush. This is kind of like instant sunshine here. You can even kind of pull out rays with it if you want to. It's another one of these brushes that kind of takes a magic touch to get it. Now I know I said that was the last thing, but I think I see a couple more things that we can add to make this a little bit better. Let's go to this canvas layer. Let's add a new layer. Let's call this trees far. We should have done this a little while ago, but it's kind of optional. Let's use a sponge to throw in some kind of background trees. And sometimes it's nice to see that you can add things afterwards, after you think you may be gone too far. So let's pick a blue-gray color. Let's put in some trees. Let's use multiply and blend mode. And down here towards the bottom, I'm going to put in some stuff like that. Now maybe these are really, really far away trees. Now what I'm going to do is, after putting them in, I'm going to use the diffuse blur to blur them so they appear to be kind of behind the other layers. That's just some kind of background trees. And on top of all these other layers, I always like to do these vignettes. I feel like this really helps it kind of look like a photograph, makes it a little more dramatic by darkening the edges. So let's use the same color that we have here. Again, we'll use a multiply composite method. We'll use the digital airbrush. And with a pretty big brush, let's darken the top corners, the top edge a little bit, so that it's darker on the outer edge of the canvas. And down towards the bottom, it doesn't matter too much. It's already pretty dark down there, but we can add a little bit just to kind of bring it all together. So there you go. That's how you can paint trees and landscapes from your imagination. You don't even need a photo as a reference. You can just kind of go at it and make up your own worlds. That's the fun of digital painting. I use these layers a lot rather than just a single layer because, as you could see, it gave me a lot of advantages as far as editability and being able to experiment and not worry about ruining my piece. So I hope you enjoyed working on this painting at home. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video and share it, and that'll make it easier for other artists out there to find this information. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.